The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike Big Wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
This is Chris from Amateur Traveler, and I am off traveling this week, so this show is coming to you from the Amateur Traveler archives. It's one of my favorites from a little while back, and I hope you enjoy it. Amateur Traveler, episode 821. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about salt flats and desert, silver mines and colonial cities, skyways, llama fetuses, and bowler hats as we go to Bolivia. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about Bolivia. I'd like to welcome to the show Jayne Dear, who is a travel writer who's coming to us from theonlywaysnotessex.com. And we're going to talk about that later for sure. Jayne, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris, for having me.
And you've come to talk to us about Bolivia.
I have, yes. Earlier this year, 2022, I did a 6-month journey through South America from Argentina right up to Colombia. It was a trip that I started in 2020, and the rest is history on that one.
Like so many trips, yes.
Yes. So I did spend 5 months there, but didn't get beyond Chile. So I went back to finish my trip, and I finally got to beautiful Bolivia on this trip. A friend of mine, a friend from school, had told me it was her favourite country of all time. And she's visited over 100 countries in a bid to do the 197, which is every country in the world. Yep. So I was absolutely intrigued because she clearly is a serious traveller. Because if you've visited over 100 countries and Bolivia is your favourite, there must be something very good about it, very special about it. And I don't have favourite countries. I've visited about 85 countries, but I don't have favourite countries because I see unique and wonderful things in every country I go to. Also some trials and tribulations, obviously. Sure. But I find it very hard to actually say, oh, yes, this is a country that I favour over another. But I have to say, I did love Bolivia. I spent 3 weeks travelling through Bolivia. I travelled as a backpacker. I travelled from the south up through to the north. So from Argentina up through to Peru. And that's quite a well-worn trail that I would recommend. But if people are coming from North America and they want to do just Bolivia as a destination, they'll probably fly into La Paz, which is the political capital.
And before we do that, I'm going to interrupt you just a little bit here, but before we start getting into the details, why should someone go to Bolivia before we have them landing in La Paz and exploring? Yeah. Let's think about why they got on the plane.
They should go to Bolivia because it's a very diverse country. It has the largest salt flats in the world, the Uyuni salt flats, which I visited. And I did that on a 3-day tour. They should also go because it's a great way of having a budget trip to the Amazon. It has part of the Amazon
Amazon
rainforest,
Basin.
yes, in the northeast. And you can go there and have amazing experiences, see all the classic wildlife in the Amazon rainforest, and it is much cheaper than if you go to the classic Brazil destinations. It's a very diverse country. I think it's the 27th largest country in the world. You don't think of it as a big country, but it is.
No.
It's landlocked, and there's a dry forest as well as the rainforest, the El Chaco, which again is in the eastern side of the country. There are wetlands, so it shares the Pantanal with Brazil. Obviously, the Andes is absolutely spectacular. There are deserts in the south. There are incredible deserts. I particularly enjoyed the Salvador Dali Desert. And it's called Salvador Dali Desert for a reason, because it's as if it's an impressionist painting. I know Salvador Dali isn't an impressionist painter, but it's soft pastel colours, the plains and the mountains. It's absolutely beautiful, and volcanoes. It has a lot of coloured lagoons that you can travel one to the other, and they have spectacular backdrops of classic cone volcanoes and amazing wildlife. So some of them are absolutely covered in flamingos.
Why don't we get back to the itinerary, which you were starting us on before that?
Yeah, I started in the south, but you can do it from north to south, but I started in the south. And I did the 3-day, 2-night tour from Waiuni, which you can also do to Pisa, which is it was further south, but most people pick it up in Waiuni. And our first...
And you're down near the salt flats and the desert part at that
Yes,
point.
Waiuni is right on the edge of the salt flats. So they're known as the Waiuni salt flats. They're the largest in the world. They're roughly the size of Jamaica. So that puts it into context. And you get a different experience if you go in the dry season compared to the wet season. You need to consider when you travel to Bolivia the season, because if you go to the salt lakes in the wet season, which I did, you can see the mirror effect on the salt flats. So we drove out onto the salt flats, and it's covered by a film of several millimeters of water when I was there. I think it does get deeper. And in the distance are mountains and fluffy clouds, and they are reflected in the lake that is formed on the salt flats. It looks actually like a frozen lake if you didn't know that it's not a frozen lake. It was formed, I think, 25 million years ago when the Andes were pushed up. So it was originally under the sea, and then it was pushed up. As the Andes were pushed up, it became a lake that then evaporated, the water evaporated, and it became a salt lake. So it's a very unique place. It's a very stark, barren place because it's incredibly flat. It's 100 miles across at its greatest distance. And you see the mountains rising up in the distance. It's absolutely stunning. Now, if you go there in the dry season, you can reach Cactus Island. Cactus Island is... I only saw photographs of it because I was there in the wet season and it's too flooded to go there. But I have fellow travellers who sent pictures of it, and it's like Cactus Island is like an island, a brown island that rises up out of the salt flats and is covered in cactus. So if you go in the dry season, that's what you do. And then you see the salt flats are very crusted and they form amazing patterns. We stayed in a salt hotel and we ate our meals in salt restaurants, which are incredible because everything's made of salt. I tested it out. I tasted the walls and the bed and the bedside tables and the dressing table, and they're all made of salt. And then they have beautiful murals on the walls that are carved out of salt of indigenous people and llamas and alpacas. And Everything's made out of salt, obviously, apart from the bathroom, which wouldn't be very practical. But
No,
I
not so much.
no, I would highly recommend that people stay in a salt hotel as part of the experience. Now, they have salt hotels for all budgets. We stayed in a beautiful salt hotel, but it wasn't 5-star, although inside it could have been. But there are, in the middle of the salt flats, there is a salt hotel and restaurant where people stay. So you can pick them according to your budget. But if you book on a tour, then the first night, you just need to check, but it's normally in a salt hotel. And then we had our meals, lunch, dinner, breakfast on that day in salt restaurants. So the tables, the chairs were all made out of salt. Yes. And we had llama on the menu on that day, which is something I recommend people try when they're in Bolivia, because Bolivia is really the capital of the llama and the alpaca herds. And then there are vicuñas. Vicuñas are the wild cousins of the llama and the alpaca, which have been domesticated. And they have tassels on their ears to identify them, a bit like, certainly in the UK, we have a blob of paint on the sheep to identify them. But there they have beautiful tassels on their ears so that people can identify who they belong to. But yeah, so out on the salt flats, there are cold water springs that come from the distant volcanoes. There are carvings. So they've carved monuments to Bolivar and statues, etc., out on the salt flats. And then there's evidence of local people mining the salt flats for salt. They're so huge that local people do earn a living from the salt on the salt flats. So after a day on the salt flats, we then drove south to the Eduardo Alvaro Reserve, which is an important reserve. And we went past an array of coloured lagoons. So there's the red lagoon, the blue lagoon, the white lagoon, the green lagoon. They're all absolutely spectacular, but you do lose count of your lagoons in the end. And as I say, they have backdrops of spectacular volcanoes. We stopped at one point in the desert where there were rock sculptures, totally natural, created by wind and weathering. And you could climb all over them, and they were absolutely spectacular.
And at this point, you're in the furthest southwest point, almost
you
Chile,
are.
almost Argentina. Okay.
You can actually, our guide, Gonzalo, pointed out Chile and Argentina. So you could see over the border, because you can see so far to the huge mountains that rise up to about 12,000 feet. You can see over the borders. Very far south, there are geysers. Now, I've seen geysers before, but many people in the group hadn't. So that was very special for them, and mud pots. So if you haven't been...
And just for translation from English to English here, so we would say geysers, and a geyser is an old guy.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I'm assuming you're talking about the water formation.
Yes. Yeah. Geysers.
Okay.
Yes.
There may have also been some geysers at the geysers, but that's an entirely different thing. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Different pronunciation. Yeah. Geysers. Yes. And that it was often a very surreal landscape. You felt as if you were on a different planet. It's very remote. I was glad that I went with a tour group for that part of the trip, because I like to travel independently, but that wouldn't be practical to do that 3-day tour. So it was good. I was supposed to have an English tour guide, but he or she never materialised because they were still suffering from the effects of COVID, not so many foreign tourists. So I went with a Spanish guide, but we had 2 Spanish speakers who spoke fluent English. And out of the 5 of us, or 6 of us, 4 of us were English anyway. So it didn't matter in the end.
And I have to ask, with as much time as you spent in South America, how is your Spanish? And is this a place that you can get by without knowing some Spanish?
My Spanish is, yes, intermediate. I'm far from fluent, but I can have a basic conversation. I can find my way around. When I was in Argentina, I hitchhiked for 3 days and only spoke Spanish and got by, but it's far from fluent. However, fellow travellers will often speak Spanish and English because they come from other South American countries. So there were a lot of people travelling from Argentina, from Peru to see Bolivia, I think particularly at the moment because there are fewer travellers from Europe, America and Asia. So it brings down the prices for those people, and they were taking the opportunity, which was good to see, to explore their own continent when probably they couldn't have afforded to do so. It can be difficult because it's not like Europe where many people will speak English. A lot of South Americans don't speak English. However, I do find that South American Spanish is easier to understand than Spanish. So I learned Spanish at school, and I've travelled to Spain a number of times. Initially I tried to speak Spanish, high Spanish, so cerveza, which is
with your
the
Cinco and
exactly Cinco. And I realised that actually that's not a good way of doing it. They just say cerveza. So how we would say it phonetically. So in the end, I just trained myself to say it in the way they would say it and pronounce it in South America. And they understood me more easily. And I found that I understood them more easily than I do when I'm in Spain, listening to people speaking high Spanish. So that was good. So on our second night, we had a hotel near hot springs, which was good. So we went down in the evening and watched the sunset from the hot springs. And then myself and a few of the other travellers got up early in the morning, I think about 5 o'clock, and went back down to the hot springs. The stars were incredible because there's no light pollution at all. And we sat in the hot springs and watched the sun come up. And that was a very unusual sunrise because it comes up and it's dissipated by all the steam that's rising up from all the volcanic activity in the area. So whilst I'm not one for getting up early if I can help it, it was worth it for that.
Okay.
The other thing to remember is it gets very cold at night. It's because of
You're in a
altitude.
desert.
Yes, you're not just because you're in the desert, you're so high up.
Also high.
Yes.
Okay.
It's at a lot of it was 12,000 feet because you're in the high Andes. And you get this throughout the western side of Bolivia. If you go to the rainforest or the El Chaco dry forest or the Pantanal, you're down at sea level again. But if you travel the route that I travelled, it was cold at night. It could be very warm and sunny during the day. It's warmer in the wet season than it is in the dry season.
That makes sense.
Yes, they don't have the 4 seasons. They have wet and dry season. But I do feel the cold, and I had 4 blankets on my bed at night.
Okay.
They would always give you extra blankets, and I would often wear several layers of clothes because it does get chilly and it doesn't seem to bother the locals. Whereas we would have roaring fires and double glazing and heating. They don't seem to have that very often unless you stay in 4 and 5 star hotels. But it depends. If you're more of a budget traveller, you often don't find that. So it can get chilly at night, but it never stopped me sleeping or bothered me too much.
This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Masterclass. For a gift that's always on time and lasts a lifetime, you can't do better than Masterclass. With Masterclass, your loved ones can learn from the best to become their best. I just started a class called Achieve More with Gen AI, which was really one of the better classes I've seen on Gen AI that does not just the theory, but practically walking through for 15 minutes in the first episode how you would use ChatGPT to come up with business ideas and implement them. Fascinating. Masterclass is the only streaming platform where you can learn, grow with over 200 of the world's best. That's why Wirecutter calls it an invaluable gift. Get unlimited learning, learn from any Masterclass instructor anywhere on a smartphone, computer, smart TV, or even in audio mode. I'm enjoying what I'm learning in Masterclass, and I think you will too, and so will your loved ones. Plus, there's no risk. Every new membership comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Give your loved ones a year of learning with Masterclass. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/traveler for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/traveler. Masterclass.com/traveler. And thanks to Masterclass for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
And then obviously you have to think about altitude sickness. But again, I wasn't really bothered by altitude sickness. It can affect you any age, any fitness.
And it's hard to predict who will tend to it and who will not.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. They chew coca leaves or drink coca tea. You can't take any back to the States or to Europe. I had to drink all my coca tea before I flew home because it's illegal, but it doesn't actually have any hallucinogenic effect on you, but it does help with altitude sickness. So lots of people will just chew some in the side of their mouths just to alleviate the effects of, you can get a headache or it may stop you from sleeping. I was never sure whether it was just tiredness or whether it was altitude sickness, so it didn't affect me badly. The other thing to consider is when I first went into Bolivia, I'd gone up gradually over several weeks through Argentina, where you go up to altitude and then into Bolivia. However, if you fly from the States, for example, to Bolivia, you're going within a matter of hours to altitude.
All at once, right.
All at once. So you need to give yourself a few days to acclimatize, whether you're badly affected or not. But obviously the best way to counteract altitude is to go back down to sea level, but that isn't easy when you're in the middle of Bolivia. But as I say, I didn't meet anybody that was badly affected by it. I think when you read about it, I was quite nervous about it. I was anticipating that I may suffer from the effects of it, but in the end I didn't. So I would try not to worry too much about it, but just be aware that it can be something that may be a serious issue for you, but unlikely to be.
I think I usually find that at 12,000 feet or so, 2 miles up, that it doesn't tend to be I have to get down because or I will die sort of thing. Like if you're climbing Kilimanjaro, then you're up another mile or so, and then it can be serious, but it can knock you out.
It can, yes. It can make you breathless, definitely. I definitely felt breathless. And when I was at higher altitude, you can climb volcanoes in Bolivia. I didn't because I saved that for Peru.
One can climb volcanoes.
Yes, yes.
I don't know that I can climb them.
No,
but okay.
but one can if one desires. And I did do some high altitude climbing when I was in Peru. And yes, that does make you very breathless. But there are, I'll talk later about Sucre, which is only about 6,000 feet, 2,000 meters. So that's quite pleasant because it's not at such high altitude, it's warmer. But I'll talk about that a bit later if I may. So we gradually made our way back up to Waiuni, and then from Waiuni I got a bus up to Potosi. Potosi is UNESCO World Heritage town. It's, as I said, I travelled by bus. The buses are very comfortable. They're normally double-decker. I always booked the panoramic seat at the front. You can have a situation where there's no seat belt or the window's a bit loose, but generally I found them quite comfortable. And a lot of people from the bus.
Second-class bus is what I'm hearing there.
Yes.
Not the high end with the Wi-Fi, but not the low end with the chickens.
Yes, yeah. I think they would have been quite high end, but they're a bit run down. Now they may have come from different countries and been used in Europe or America, or they just may have been used for a long time. But they all have toilets on them, and they have quite big, like business class airline type seats. So if a lot of people travel overnight on them, and you can recline right back on them. People do say, watch your belongings. So I never left valuables on the seat when I went to the toilet. But it's a great way of interacting with the local people. They will often get on to the bus. And if it's a day, during the day, people would say Buenos dias, Buenas tardes to everybody on the bus. And then I chatted to people, the local, on my travels. So it was a great way of experiencing local life. But you can fly cheaply from place to place if you so desire. If you only have 1 week, then I would certainly recommend you do some flying between places. It's not expensive. So Potosi is a very Bolivian town. It's at about 12,000 feet, and it's most famous for the Cerro Rico, which is a huge silver mine. And it's been mined for silver since the colonial times. So the Spanish apparently, as a fun fact, the Spanish apparently took enough silver out of the mines, not the conquistadors, they obviously had local people to do that for them, and sent it back to Spain, to the king in Spain. And they say that there's enough silver was taken out to build a silver railway between Potosi and Madrid. So it was a very rich seam of silver. And the interesting thing about that is you can visit the mines in Potosi. So I visited the mines on a trip. You can either do the hardcore tour, which young people tend to do. I decided not to do that.
Steps or what?
No, I got the impression it was shuffling your way on your stomach through very narrow shafts. I don't suffer particularly from claustrophobia, but I just didn't fancy it at my age, in my late 50s. It was quite clear that I spoke to some younger people that did it, and that one of them had to come out halfway through because he was 32, I think, and he said, "Oh, it just wasn't for me. I just had a panic attack." So the one that I went into, it was about way overhead height. It was quite narrow and very dark, but it is a working mine. So you go to the miners' market beforehand and you buy them some fizzy drink and some coca leaves to give them, because I guess having tourists go round your working mine, you need some compensation. So we just gave our guide a sort of a few dollars, and they bought some supplies for us to give to the miners as we went round. And as we got
mines, but never a working mine. That's
I know.
the sound in my voice of surprise. Okay.
You couldn't do it in Europe or in America because of health and safety. The health and safety was not of Western standards. So in some ways, if you're prepared to take the risk, and I could see, having organised school trips and filled in countless health and safety forms, I could see that it was potentially dangerous, but it wasn't. So long as you were sensible and you looked where you were treading, it was going to be an amazing experience. And it was. We stood on the slag heap looking out over the town. We had to get dressed up, miners' outfits, with a hard hat and a headlamp. And then we went into the mine with sort of trucks coming that would push the trucks along rails out and then tip them out into lorries to be taken away. Women process a lot of the material when it comes out of the mines. Women don't work in the mines, but they do process the materials when it comes out. I've just got a short extract from the book that I'm writing to read about my experience going into the mine, which hopefully will give listeners an idea of how it felt to go in. So entering the mine shaft was like going through the gates of hell. Almost immediately, we were alerted to bright lights coming hurtling towards us through the darkness. They were the lights on the miners' helmets. And as the carts tore clattering towards us down the narrow shafts, we had to throw ourselves to the side of the tunnel. Along a side tunnel, we found a miner chipping away at a seam. We shuffled past a deep hole and on to where a miner was filling a cart with mined materials. The air was thick with dust, but he wasn't wearing an industrial-grade mask. Come to think of it, neither was I. There was an unnerving hissing noise. People die in mines when poisonous gas builds up. Juan, our guide, assured us that it was oxygen from a compressor for machinery. A group of miners, once on a break, told us that the pay was good. At about $1,500 a month, it was very good. But when we passed a deep shaft, a black hole that went down 100 feet, and were told that there were miners working down there, it became clear that they earned every penny. Halfway through the tour, Juan casually mentioned that we shouldn't touch the white stuff on the walls. It's asbestos, he told us. Isn't that the stuff they normally remove using hazmat suits? I asked him, horrified at the realisation that I'd steadied myself on the walls countless times already. Health and safety was not a thing. They seemed to rely on an alcove where there was a devil-like creature that they gave offerings to for protection. It clearly didn't work because sadly many died by the age of 40 of silicosis and in accidents. So that was my diary that I wrote up that night when I got back to my hotel. And yes, it was an amazing experience. And the fact that you can go into a mine there that you wouldn't be able to go into in probably most of the world. As you said, you've been into mines, but not working mines. And we were literally with the miners. It wasn't a case of we were kept away watching them from a distance. We were having to get out of the way as they pushed the carts. Yes, it was quite
the one thing I would be specifically concerned about as somebody who's 6'3" in a Bolivian mine is that in the whole world, the country with the statistically shortest people is Bolivia. Is that going to be an extra problem for a tall person in a Bolivia silver mine?
You might have to stoop in a few places, but if you go into the one that I went into on my tour, myself and another man who was older went into the mine shaft that's closer to the top, and you didn't need to be crawling through narrow spaces. So if you were tall, yes, you would still be able to go in there. And if you're not particularly claustrophobic, but if you're really claustrophobic, we did go 250 meters in and there wasn't much light. And as I said, you had to be careful because there was no warning of deep holes that went down 100 feet. Yes, it was
I can't think of what cave I was in somewhere in the world. And at one point the tour had to divide in two because they said you can either roll through here or you could go around and come back with us. And half the group went, no.
Yes, absolutely.
Completely no.
I agree with you. I compared the one that the younger people did to the skydiving equivalent of going in a mine. It was just scary by the sounds of it. And whilst I consider myself to be a very adventurous person, I do draw the line. And I do think also as you get older, there are certain things that become harder. I should say I was one of the ones
who rolled through. But
Oh, I'm impressed. Very good. Okay. Obviously, the mine in Potosi is very important, but the rest of the town,
city that Silver built.
Yes, absolutely. It is a bit faded and a bit run down, but the House of Coin, which is a colonial mint, very important, is one of the oldest buildings in South America, and I'd highly recommend that you go on a tour. So again, I went on a Spanish tour, but the tour guide spoke some English, so she gave me the salient points as we went round. And it used, obviously, the silver and the gold from the region to make coins during colonial times. And then when Bolivia got its independence in 1825, it then took over as the Bolivian mint. It's no longer used as a mint anymore. It's a museum now. But I'd recommend that you go there and have a wander around the colonial town. But it's as I say, it's a UNESCO World Heritage site.
So that would be the House of Coin. That'd be the Casa Nacional de la Moneda, the National House of Money.
Yes, absolutely, literally. Yes, yeah. They literally early on in colonial times, they had mules that they bought from Argentina to walk or move the huge wheels in order to make
Okay.
ingots, to press ingots. So, yeah, it was very interesting to see. And they had some colonial era paintings. It was a fascinating tour. From Potosi, I then took a collectivo. Collectivo is like a
Collective
shared
taxi.
taxi, which is great. I turned up and shared it with 3 other people. It was about $8 for a 3-hour journey, I know, through the Andes up to Sucre. Now, Sucre is the constitutional capital of Bolivia, and then La Paz is the political capital.
The
And
constitutional capital. Now, there is a
yes,
phrase I do not know.
no, I didn't realise. It's just, I guess, the official capital. They signed the constitution there in
Sure, I got
1825.
that part.
Yeah, and they call it the constitutional capital. But the
Okay.
political, so it's the official capital, but the political capital, as in Parliament, is in La Paz. So most people
Okay.
would say La Paz was the capital, but I'm not sure. In a pub quiz, I think you'd have to say Sucre is or Sucre, depending on how you pronounce it, is the capital. But yeah, so let's say they have 2 capitals. The thing about Sucre is it's a bit of a relief after the sort of rough and ready of Bolivia. Potosi, as I said, was a very Bolivian town, whereas Sucre, it's only about 6,000 feet high, so it's warmer, it doesn't get as cold at night, and it's felt far more westernized. It's a beautiful whitewashed colonial town, so it's a total contrast to Potosi. I did a tour of where they signed the Constitution. It used to be during colonial times. Again, it's one of the oldest buildings in South America, and it is called
The House of Freedom.
Casa de la Liberación. So yes, the House of Freedom in English. And it, again, is a museum that you do on a tour. And I went into the room where they signed the Constitution, and then Bolivar became their first president. So they're incredibly proud of this building. It's a beautiful colonial town.
Which is, of course, also where the name of the country comes from. I think most people have figured that out. Yep.
Yes, absolutely. Like, it felt very Spanish, actually. It could have been in Spain. As I say, it was westernized, had a large plaza in the centre, beautiful colonial churches. And then I climbed up to the Recoleta monastery at the top of the hill that has beautiful views over the rooftops and the surrounding Andes Mountains. And Sucre was a good place where you could go and get a coffee, a westernized type coffee. There were good bars and restaurants, lots of mid-budget to 4 or 5-star hotels. Yes, it's definitely somewhere that was a bit of a sort of good place to pause and relax and feel a bit as if you could enjoy some home comforts before going to La Paz. Because La Paz is a totally amazing but crazy place. I got a bus up to La Paz overnight, but you may wish to fly that leg of the journey. And as we came through, it's 2 cities together. So El Alto is up on the high plateau, and then La Paz, I came through El Alto, which is where you fly to. And then I thought, this is nothing special. I thought it was the outskirts of La Paz, but it was actually El Alto. And as we drove through El Alto, we rounded a sort of a curve, and then down below us was this huge bowl with La Paz sprawled across it. Lots of rough brick-built shantytown type buildings, but with incredible scenery around it. The mountains are surrounding it. So you've got, for example, Illimani Mountain, which is 21,000 feet. It's the second highest mountain in Bolivia, and you can see it from most places in La Paz if the weather is good. And as I say, it's a fairly crazy place. It's very gridlocked down at ground level, but it has an amazing cable car system. And since 2019, when the Silver Line was introduced, it's become the longest urbanised cable car system in the world. It's got 32 stations, 10 lines, and they're all colour-coded, and it's 20 miles in total. It reminded me a bit of the London Underground, but above ground, because it weaves its way in and out. So you can get off of one line, connect to another line, and work your way all around the city as if you're a bird flying over the shanty towns. There's one area which is where they've painted all the buildings like a huge mural, which is beautiful. There's another where you can go right over the main cemetery and just generally see life going on below. It's very inexpensive. The locals complained that it was quite expensive compared to buses, for example. But for a Westerner, it's very inexpensive. And you can travel all around. It goes right up the bowl to El Alto, and then you can travel across El Alto, the city up on the plateau, which is about 12,000 feet high. And you can look down at a lot of markets up there. Yeah, it was incredible. There are football fields up on the plateau, and whilst Bolivia isn't a very good football team in general, it does well in home games because all the visiting teams struggle with the altitude.
Altitude, yeah.
Yeah, they're acclimatized. They were celebrating because they beat Argentina recently in a home game. They would never beat them outside of Bolivia, but yeah, that was an interesting fact. I did, when I was actually in the city itself, which did feel very frenetic, quite chaotic, but they have a fleet of old Dodge buses from the 50s and 60s from America. Okay. They're incredibly well maintained. It feels as if you're in a museum, and you can just ride around because it's part of their public transport system for a sort of 50 cents on a Dodge bus. I just got on the bus and just rode on it until it got to the end of the line, and then I turned around, got another one back into the centre. It's an incredible experience. I loved it. It felt as if Rosa Parks was going to get on and sit next to me at any moment because they really were from the 50s and 60s. The other place to go in the city is the Witches' Market. Although Bolivia is a very Catholic country, they still, it's mixed with the old traditions of pre-colonial time, the Incas and the pre-Columbia times. And so the Witches' Market, although it attracts tourists, it's very much for local people. So local people go there to buy llama fetuses and dried frogs and all sorts of weird and wonderful potions to
which is
luck.
helpful because around here I have a hard time getting my llama fetuses.
Yes, you would do. Oh, no, you wouldn't. There's llama fetuses of all shapes and sizes. Yeah, it was fascinating. So... Yes, if you want to take back a llama fetus, my friend who loves Bolivia does have a llama fetus in her a collection.
Pickled or dried? I hesitate to ask.
Dried, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, dried. Yes. They just look like like baby llama, stuffed llamas, but they are fetuses. Yes. And Bolivia is one of the best places.
Buried under the foundations of many Bolivia houses as a sacrifice to a pre-Columbian goddess.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yes, although, as I say, it's a strange dichotomy because they are very religious. They follow the Catholic religion. If you go into a church in Bolivia on a Sunday or even on other days, it will be full of people, but it's still mixed with the traditions of the Incas and even further back, the pre-Columbian times. Now, from La Paz, I did a day trip out to Tiwanaku, which was my favourite pre-Columbian site after those in Peru. So after Machu Picchu and the ones around Cusco and the Sacred Valley, which are impossible to beat, this was my favourite pre-Columbian. It goes back way before the Incas.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe, they don't know that much about it because there was no written history in pre-Columbian times, but they think that it influenced the Inca civilization and the famous Wari civilizations. There are no actual buildings left, but there's a sun gate, a moon gate. It was supposed to have had very religious and spiritual connotations. And so there's a temple, a subterranean temple with some amazing carved heads on the walls. I was very struck by how fascinating it was. It wasn't that busy when we were there, and you really did feel a connection with the people that lived there thousands of years ago. They think that it was deserted in about 1000 AD, but they don't know why. So way before even the Inca civilization. As we went out to, it's about 3 hours, 2.5, 3 hours outside of La Paz, and I went on.
Oh, it didn't look like it would be nearly that far.
I went on a minibus
Okay.
that was
So you did a
dropping
lot of
local
stops.
people.
Okay.
So yes, we did some stops. If you go on a tour, then yes, it might be
It
quicker.
looks like it's 30 miles or something like that from La Paz.
Yes, I always joke about how on a German motorway you could do it in 30 minutes, but in South America it's 5
It's 3
hours.
hours.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, just because I fell into that or started to fall into that trap all the time of going,
Sure.
oh yes, it's this long, and then just because the roads are very poor, they're dirt roads to get out there, so you can't travel very fast. They're not high-speed tarmac roads for some of the way. So I've got a short piece that I wrote about my journey out to Tiwanaku. As we drove across the Altiplano, we passed scattered rural settlements where peasant farmers scratched out a living from farming herds of cows and flocks of sheep. Their homes were rough shacks with roofs made of straw or tin. This was where our fellow passengers lived. It was a world apart from mine, but as two women got off, they showed us a 7 Bolivia coin and emphasized that this was the fare. They knew that as foreigners, we were likely to be overcharged. It was touching that these bowler-hatted sisters were watching over us. Unfortunately, we were overcharged, and the driver refused to listen to our protests. If our bowler-hatted friends had still been on the bus, I instinctively knew that he wouldn't have got away with that. So it was good because we sat at the back of the bus and all the locals got on and all the women wear the Derby bowler hats. And they're very expensive, the best ones. Somebody on one of the cable cars, a local, told me that they can cost up to $500. Yeah, they're made of suede and they were actually introduced from England, from the UK, by the men who went to build the railways in the 1920s. So that was an interesting connection for somebody that comes from England. And they were adopted by the Chola or Cholita indigenous women. And I found it fascinating because they're so expensive, these bowler hats, that if it rains, they cover them in plastic bags to protect them. The Cholita women also wear a shawl, a coloured shawl that's either wool or embroidered silk. And it's held together by a brooch, a beautiful brooch. They wear the polera skirts, which are big skirts that are rounded out by several underskirts. And they have 2 plaits going down their shoulders that are tied together by a tassel. And then as much jewellery as they can afford. And then a shawl, a coloured shawl that they wear. It's called an agio. It's a colourful cloth sling, really. And they carry babies and shopping and all sorts of things in those colourful shawls. And it struck me while I was there that you have to go a long way to see people that just wear traditional dress as their everyday dress. most places in Asia and Africa have adopted Western style dress. You have to go off the beaten track into the Masai Mara or way into the wilds of China to see people that still wear traditional costume. But you will see it everywhere in Bolivia. It's the most South American of South American countries, if you ask me, for the icons like llama, herds of llama and alpaca. People think, oh, llama and alpaca, that's South America. But in reality, you only see them in Bolivia and in southern Peru, southern half of Peru. That you don't see them everywhere. And then the dress, the local women, and the men to a certain extent, but not so many, more in Bolivia and Peru than you do anywhere else. So Chile, Argentina, even Colombia and Ecuador are much more westernized now.
And I'm going to do a time check here because we're coming
Yes.
up on an hour long.
Okay. Yeah. I was just going to give you one top tip for Americans. If you can pay for tours, or they want you to pay for tours in American dollars, but make sure they are pristine from the bank, because they will not accept anything else. Even if they've got a fold or a tear in them, they won't accept them. Just make sure they're pristine, and then you can change to bolivars, but they won't let you change them unless they're pristine. So that's just something to remember. Okay.
Anything else we want to cover in terms of itinerary before we get to some of our wrap-up questions?
Final place I would recommend that you go to is north of La Paz. It took me most of a day to get there on a bus, and I do recommend you go by bus because you get beautiful views. Is the Bolivian side of Lake Titicaca.
Sure.
So I took a bus up to Copacabana, and from there I went over to Isla del Sol, which is one of the islands in the middle of Lake Titicaca. Lake Titicaca is the highest navigable lake in the world. It's enormous. Bolivia shares it with Peru, and I stayed overnight on Isla del Sol, and I would really recommend that you do that if you have the time, because a lot of people do it as a day trip. But if you stay overnight, the day trippers go and you just get the chance to see rural life. People scratch out a living in the fields, farming broad beans and quinoa, which is very popular in Bolivia. And then they have a few sheep and a few cows, and you just wander around the paths. There are some Inca ruins and some incredible views across the lake to the high Andes Mountains in the distance, and then up the coast to Peru. So I would really recommend you do that. And then I went over the border into Peru, but then you could also go back to La Paz to fly home if you were just there for Bolivia.
Did you actually cross the border on a bus or on a ferry?
On a bus.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, it's not possible to do it on a ferry. I did it on a bus. Yeah, it was quite a simple process to get out of Bolivia. Not so simple getting in during COVID times.
Okay.
But that was because of COVID. Yes.
Got it.
Yeah. Normally, I think it's fine. Yes.
Any other things that people should know in general before they go to Bolivia?
It's a very unique country, but it's not an easy country to travel around for a Westerner who will find that, as I've already alluded to during this podcast, the health and safety and the comfort is not always what it would be in the West. However, if you're prepared to take the rough with the smooth, you'll have an incredible experience. It's an absolutely amazing country. One trip actually that people do, but I didn't because I was there in the wet season. Again, you have to think wet or dry, is the Death Road. And I believe that was mentioned on an earlier podcast on Bolivia. Yes, it's other travellers did it after I left because it was the dry season and it looks amazing, but it's something to consider.
This is the rugged road in the Andes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can do it as a day trip from La Paz, and many people do. I was going to do it, but the weather was awful, and there's no point doing it in the wet season because the weather was normally very good in Bolivia, But if you go up into the high Andes to do this, it's possible that the clouds will come down on you, and then it's not ideal. But during the dry season, it's perfect. I would have done it during the dry season. It's a full day. So I'd recommend that if it's the dry season when you're there.
Excellent. As we get to some of our wrap-up questions, you were standing in the prettiest spot in Bolivia. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I'm standing on the famous salt flats and I'm looking out at the mirror image of the mountains and the clouds, the fluffy clouds arranged across the tops of the mountains. It was absolutely awe-inspiring. There are many superlatives that you could use to describe it. I felt really exhilarated when I was there. It's no other place in the world.
Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Bolivia?
Oh, I think it was travelling on the minibuses, because you'd be on the minibus and the women would get on with the Cholita women would get on with their huge, colourful slings with small babies and all sorts of potatoes and big sacks of alfalfa or quinoa. And we chug along together through the bumpy roads, back roads of Bolivia. And I think also the sort of camaraderie that you get with the local people. They are very friendly and very helpful. They're interested in you and they want you to enjoy their country.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize Bolivia in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Oh, very hard. I came up with a lot, but I would say surreal. Because, as I said, in many places it felt as if I was on another planet, perhaps Mars or the moon. Enigmatic. It's a very unusual country because it has deep roots back to pre-Columbian and Inca times. Many people still speak Aymara and Quechua local languages, not Spanish. So it's an enigma that you need to unwrap and get underneath the skin of Bolivia, and unique. It's really like nowhere else.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Jayne Dear. And Jayne, your website, as we mentioned, is theonlywaysnotessex.com. And you have to explain how one came up with The Only Way Is Not Essex.
Yes, your British listeners will understand that. We have a very famous programme about the county where I live, which is The Only Way Is Essex, as in it's about life in Essex. And when I went off to travel to far-flung places well away from Essex, I decided to call my website The Only Way Is Not Essex. So it's a play on the reality television programme.
Now, you're writing the book, so I'm trusting that when you finish the book and publish it, and I think you're self-publishing this, you'll give me a link that I can put in the show notes so that people can find the book.
I will.
Short of that, are they going to find any writings on your website about Bolivia, or do we need to wait for the book?
You need to wait for the book for Bolivia, but I will publish on there some blog posts, because I also put blog posts on some of the ones that I've read during the podcast. Plus, there are links to a book that I wrote after my travels in South America during the year of 2020. I finished work in December 2019 to do more adventure travel. And not great timing, but I managed to actually do my best in 2020. So I published the Chaotic 20 Travel Diaries, which include my travels in South America and 3 months in Turkey, where I could travel to in the fall of that year. Obviously, Chaotic 20 is a play on COVID-19. And then the year after I couldn't go too far afield, so I travelled within the Balkans. So I published It's All a Load of Balkan, which I don't know whether Americans will understand that, will I? I didn't know whether that was a British joke.
That one I got. Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. So there are links to those 2 books on my website, and I will obviously send you a link when the current book is published, which the title will be Better Late Than Never, in view of the fact that I went back to finish my trip from 2020.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Jayne Dear. Jayne, thank you so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Bolivia.
Thank you, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm a big fan of your podcasts, and I can now say that I've actually been a part of one, so I'm really delighted. Thank you very much.
Special thanks go out to the patrons of the show. If you're interested in supporting Amateur Traveler because you've had great vacations because you listen to the show, go to patreon.com/Amateur Traveler. If you haven't gone on vacation after listening to it on Amateur Traveler, do that and see if you don't have a great time. I got some corrections for the last week's show we did in Thessaloniki. Unusually, these corrections were from our guest, I must make 2 corrections. The famous artifacts, the golden larynx, the proper name of the box I mentioned, and the gold grave crown from the Macedonian tomb of Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, are now located in the Archaeological Museum of Vergina and not in the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki. The exchange of populations happened in 1922. I don't know why I said 1921, as this is a very well-known fact to me and all Greeks. I apologize for these inaccuracies, and thanks so much. We do try and be as accurate as we can, but I am obviously not going to catch everything as I'm listening to the show, and I hope you will understand we try and do our best. What we're really trying for is, when you listen to the show, is that someplace you think you would enjoy? And if we've accomplished that, then we've done what we've set out to do. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.